Welcome, everybody. This is the KubeVirt community meeting, May 27th, 2020. First up on the agenda, we have Ashley Schuett to talk about customization of Virt Operator.
Hey, so we're recently talking about how users can customize the controller, API, and handler while using the KubeVirt operator, and some discussion on that issue. I just kind of want to pull attention to it and see what other people are thinking. Right now we're talking about storing patches and kind of having them replayed on deployments, but I'm not sure how that would work with calculating the current state of things and the desired state of things if we're having a list of patches, since we wouldn't really know what the environment variables or flags and stuff like that should be. I was kind of wondering if anyone had any ideas or thoughts around it.
So these patches are a series of events or things we'll play back during deployment?
Yeah, we would have to play them back to see if the current state of the deployment is in the target state, since we save that in the status field of the KubeVirt CR. And that's how we know when to reapply it.
I would find it interesting to see if when we store the JSON, when we apply the JSON patches after we have already loaded the install strategy, so that we then have in memory and Virt operator the desired state and then compare it with the cluster state, then I guess we could determine pretty easily if the end state is what we want.
Yeah, it gets a little tricky because sometimes fields are mutated once they're actually posted to the cluster. So like a service, for example, the spec will change and the cluster IP will be set. So it'll look like it's different. So it's tough to just do a one-to-one comparison. Maybe we could consider hashing our KubeVirt objects spec.
I would recommend enabling the status sub-resource for our KubeVirt object or for KubeVirt custom resource definition, because then we get how are they called, generations, the generation field bumped by Kubernetes. So whenever the spec changes, you get a new generation and you can add the generation to the objects, and then you know that they should fit. That's, for instance, how deployments solve that, where you have the same issue, right? They need to detect if the pods they're seeing are already at the right state or not.
Generation, does that reflect just the spec? Or
So you get the generation bumps for custom resources. It's automatically generated in the metadata, bumped by the API server in the metadata section. So whenever you change the spec, really the spec field, something in the spec, then it's bumped.
What about annotations or labels? Would that bump it as well?
As far as no, I can't answer it 100%, but I don't think so.
I think that's worth investigating then. So we could append that generation potentially to something if we needed to, or use that in some way. That makes sense.
Yeah, I would investigate it. I would recommend to investigate it. Yeah.
I wonder about the API because one thing. I think the patch approach will give us a lot of flexibility because we can modify every field. That's probably redundant in the proposal, but my worry is about usability. So I wonder, is the API of this approach in a way that we would allow us to introduce different method in future? So actually, do we already have an API proposal in the PR?
There's no PR for that specific thing. The only PR that was open is for configuring the flags, and that was just for the controller. But I did write up a small proposal or suggestions on that issue I linked. But I think David was a good suggestion as well because it does give so much flexibility to the user, but the usability is less so.
Improvable.
So yeah, that discussion's gone on a little bit. I think that the last thing that I posted proposed a way of including the patches in the KubeVirt CR itself in kind of a generic way. maybe we could consider something like this. I don't know a better way of doing it because we want it centralized to that KubeVirt CR in order to, I think we're going to have difficulty if we decouple it. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. But I'm still concerned about the usability of this. I think it gives us the flexibility to add different ways of manipulating components in the future if we wanted. But
what I like about this is that it's also in general an escape hatch for people to just do the things which they need to do right now for the cluster. And if there come some patterns up, we can still investigate adding special tweak values in the spec or something. I think it's not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to get at, right? So is that I mean, I totally agree, right? It gives us the flexibility and freedom. It's the escape hatch to do everything. I mean, to do all overrides. But on the other hand, I just want to make sure that if we come up with an API design, that we could add a more, convenient method to do to achieve similar goals, right? Like an alternative way to treat setting it somehow. But we'll see it on the proposal, I guess.
Yeah, I posted a link to the exact GitHub comment on an issue where I kind of meshed together Ashley's idea with putting that in the spec. So if anyone wants to comment on that during the call, it's pretty easy to review.
Just a quick question about this process. Is it possible maybe instead of applying our object and then patching it on the API server of Kubernetes, maybe we could apply the patch ourselves and just have it modified on the install strategy. And then we don't need to modify any process and we don't need to worry about any edge cases because after we apply the object, it is just like a new object.
I could not follow.
Could you explain the workflow of how that would work? Like, okay, we install KubeVirt,
because
in the CR.
Yeah, because for example, after you install KubeVirt, so yeah, let me think about it for a second.
Yeah.
So I think, you install KubeVirt and you want people to be able to modify those patches on the CR when KubeVirt is already installed, right? So for example, what if Virt operator would read the configuration on the CR all the time and modify the install strategy accordingly to what we have? Like apply the patches on the object in the install strategy instead of applying them on the API server. And then the regular process kicks in and applies it on the server.
Yeah, I think that I agree with that. It should be reflected in the install strategy. So it would be a new install strategy every time. This is pretty low level talk about how the operator works, but it would be a new install strategy every time the spec is mutated with a different patch.
I'm not absolutely sure about this, but yeah.
So if we have a higher level controller that manages the KubeVirt custom resource, the contents of it, is it still possible to take advantage of this framework if that controller is managing, like you'd have to work with that controller, right? You can't just arbitrarily make changes to the custom resource.
I think that well, yes, but this is a very specific use case. Because usually when you create the custom resource, it is what it tells the controller to kick in and start working, right? So usually a custom resource is either created by a user or a controller that creates it on behalf of the user, but then usually the user provides exactly how he wants the higher level controller to create it, right?
So in other words, the higher level controller needs to be aware of this and cooperate.
Of those fields on the KubeVirt CR, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, it needs to know how to create the CR with those fields.
Yeah, so all of this is optional, just to clarify. So we would only need to understand these patch fields if it actually needed to modify components outside of kind of the default way that they're configured. I'm hoping this is a fairly edge case. It's similar to how Customize works, where there's a base set of configs, and then people can layer on their patches for their specific environments. We'd essentially be allowing a similar workflow with the KubeVirt operator, where they can layer on their own patches onto the ones generated by our operator.
Okay, makes sense. Any other questions or comments on this?
Yeah, just one remark. I think it was discussed in that context, but because Customize became so prominent, I actually wonder if there's an opportunity to, or I wouldn't call it an opportunity, but if it would make sense to get that into the picture. I mean, to have Customize like on the cluster level in the API.
Well, actually, this would work with Customize. So you'd have your base config being just a KubeVirt CR, and then your patches would actually be adding patches to the KubeVirt CR. It would work within that flow. It's a way of kind of enabling it.
Oh, yes, no question on that, right? So I just wonder never mind. I'll take it to the. I meant something different, but I'll take it to the issue. Thank you.
So I want to make sure that we can move forward with some sort of solution here, because this is kind of multiple aspects of the community are kind of all converging on needing the ability to modify components, just maybe sometimes just really slightly in the ones that the Virt operator creates. So if we can get people involved in this discussion and come to some sort of direction that we're all comfortable with, it would be good to do that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think there's a general agreement, right, that this patch approach we have today is something we can do, which seems to be pretty straightforward and which would allow us to address the issues we have with the operator so far, so that which would give us enough flexibility to address the use cases that have been pointed out to be difficult, like custom node selectors for the daemon, for the handler, for example, right?
Yeah, so maybe just getting some more people to weigh in on that issue and just kind of further that discussion where it feels a little bit like there's consensus involved, then I feel like we can execute on it. But right now, it's just not enough people have weighed in. We'd just like to see a little bit more buy-in.
Okay, so to be clear, the discussion is happening on the issue you linked earlier that is now in the document?
Yes.
Issue 3365?
But maybe it makes sense to actually do a call out to the community. I mean, there was that very old email thread about the manifest. I'm not sure what the title was, but about why people don't adopt the operator. And maybe it's a good opportunity to revive that thread and ask the people to weigh in on that proposal just to increase the visibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was one specific community member who abandoned the operator because it didn't have the flexibility they needed. So I think as a prerequisite, we'd really like to solve that for them and make sure that whatever solution we come up with meets their needs.
Can one of you, David or Ashley, revive that thread and reach out to that community member who had that issue?
Yeah, I don't mind doing it. Unless Ashley wants it, I'll take it.
I'm not exactly sure what thread that is, so it might be easier for you.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, so next topic, I'll turn it over to Fabian to talk about custom SE Linux policies.
Yeah, I actually hope that Jed was here, but he's not. I know Vladdy could talk about it. I'll do it quickly myself. I just wanted to say that, yeah, we were looking at introducing custom SE Linux policies that might be interesting to anybody who's deploying on CentOS or what's it called? CentOS with RPM-OS tree. I'm not sure what the name is, but yeah, so that might be relevant for anybody who's using SE Linux, right? There's a custom policy coming up. We try to make that compatible with the host operating systems, but feedback is appreciated.
Was it Red Hat Core OS? Is that what you were thinking of a minute ago? Is this
Yeah, I
different?
mean, that's the product of that company, but no, I was thinking about this the CentOS project. And I think they also have an RPM-ostree-based upstream variant, which I don't recall. Yeah. Maybe CentOS, no, it's not stream, it's something else. I don't recall it. Nah, I don't recall it. I'm done, thanks.
All right. Well, I wrote RPM OS3 in the notes, so we can go back and clean that up. All right. And next, turning it back over to Ashley to talk about a Minikube add-on.
Yeah, currently working on a add-on for Minikube, so you can just enable and disable using KubeVirt with it. There's a PR up, and if anybody has any comments or input for that, let me know. But hopefully making it easy for community members to use KubeVirt and get up and running.
Great. Thank you. All right, Daniel Perez, you had a discussion you wanted to talk about a pull request that's out there.
Yeah, so we David Vossel did a pull request for enhancing KubeVirt so that we could be more native to the controllers in Kubernetes itself. I have a couple of engineers on the call. Ashok has pulled and merged, locally merged into the master and ran, but Ashok can speak to this, but basically he was able to run a VM, but it was through the old method. We're a little bit confused about the new methods for launching VMs more directly from Kubernetes versus the old method through KubeVirt. And that's what we just wanted to kind of get clarification on. Ashok, did you have anything more specific?
Yeah, so actually the thing is, how can we exercise David's patch, or how can we test David's patch, and what's the use case for testing it?
Sure. So I'm trying to think of how to most accurately answer this. The patch is a proof of concept of a kind of supporting an edge case. So this isn't the main flow of how KubeVirt is used. It's the edge case where we've seen that people would like to utilize the pod controllers, so things like deployments, stateful sets, and replica sets, or jobs, or whatever, and use those to control virtual machines. So this is kind of a side hatch for being able to use those controllers for virtual machines. So you can test the PR, and it's very limited functionality. All I did was essentially prove the concept would work for deployments. And in doing that, we should be able to extend it to other workload types as well. You can test it just by checking out my branch and building it. That would be the easiest way if you just wanted to see it work and kind of understand the details. And you can look at the changes that were made just by looking at the patch. Does that help answer your question? I try to give a little bit more context there as well.
Yeah, actually, I checked out the master, and I just patched your changes on top of the master, and I did a build, and I was able to create the VMs using YAML files. But I'm just trying to see or understand if you can create the VMs using, or if you can orchestrate VMs using this patch. Can we do that?
I'm not sure. Can you go into a little bit more detail? What do you mean by orchestrate VMs using this patch?
So like how I can control the pods, like how I can shut down the pods or upgrade the pods. Can we do the same with the VMs with this patch? Like, can I treat the VM as a container?
Yeah. Well, let me give you some more details on how the patch works. So you create a pod definition, and I've embedded allowed the ability to embed a virtual machine spec within that pod. And what's happening is when you post that pod to the Kubernetes API server, there's a mutation webhook that's taking that pod spec and mutating it to look like the virtual machine pod spec. So we construct a kind of well-defined pod spec that launches with the exact image we need, that has QEMU and everything in it, and our components for managing the virtual machine launch flow and all of that. We inject that into the pod along with any other arguments we need. And anything that you put in the pod originally is just going to be completely stripped out and replaced. So we are launching the virtual machine as a pod in containers. And the pod spec is being changed on the fly when it's being posted by our webhook.
Okay, cool. So I think the big takeaway is we can use kubectl to manage this VM now going forward.
You can use kubectl to manage the pods and deployments, and they will be running virtual machines. Essentially, you're managing the virtual machines through the pod API. That's what this PR would allow it to do. And you can also use kubectl to manage virtual machine objects, like the custom objects that we have, directly as well. It's not that kubectl has all of a sudden been unlocked for virtual machine management. It's just that you can use, you can manage them as pods.
Okay,
So,
cool.
so then if we did do the a stateful set of 2 pods, they would be controlled just like a stateful set within Kubernetes. I mean, it's the same controller.
Yeah, that's the theory behind it. So the complication with stateful sets versus like a deployment. So I tested and proved the startup flow with deployments. Stateful sets, if you're using the volume templates specifically, which I imagine you probably are, there's going to be some glue that needs to occur there to make sure that volumes are attached to the virtual machines as you would expect. I think we had like an email exchange where I might have outlined some of those complexities in a little bit more detail for you. But that's kind of the gotcha here. I think it's possible, but that's kind of the part that needs to be investigated specifically for stateful sets.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll try to ramp up a little further then on the stateful set application. But
so this is a recurring theme that has come up more than once. I mean, we've tried various different sort of approaches to reversing the role and making the pod be the thing that's in charge of the VM, a couple times now. Just curious if you could share a little bit of insight into your use case, if that's something that's public, just so that we can gain an understanding of why this is important or why this is so critical.
Sure. So we have a containerized, right now it's just a Docker container that we hope to make be like a Virt launcher pod, right? But right now we're just using Docker. We have a pair of Docker containers, and they live as a pair. They have their own HA capability. So they are aware of each other, and one of them is always active and the other one is standby. And the active one it's a VM, so we're using QEMU, and we did this independently of KubeVirt. So we use QEMU, but it's an older version of QEMU, and the pair stay in sync. And if the first pair, if the active pair fails, we fail over to the other one, and they're direct connected. So it's at the application level instead of within Kubernetes that we are doing the HA. But we want Kubernetes to manage these things as a pair, like a stateful set pair, and have status in the Kubernetes API, and use all the tools that come with KubeVirt for images and any other management of VMs. So that's kind of our use case. And like David was mentioning, we'll use Kubernetes to configure PVs for those VMs. but they're always a pair, and that's the key thing, and that's why it's close to a stateful set. But I'm not sure it's 100% a stateful set, and that's part of the investigation that we're going through.
So from what you're telling here, I think that one, if I remember it, that one behavior might be different that you may expect it, and that is when you create a stateful set and scale it up to, in this case, 2. If you have a failure on creating the first one, it will never proceed to the second one because it kind of expects that you resolve the issue before it goes on. This may be surprising, yeah.
Yeah, I know. That's the variation on stateful sets that I'm trying to work through. But I think it would work in our case because effectively when one fails, we go to the other one, the pair, the secondary becomes the primary. And if we can give through feedback to Kubernetes the status, the state may all work out. But I definitely have to work that a little more on the stateful set front, that it works in the context of stateful sets.
Just
so I think.
Please
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say the question is, whether we just try to work this PR for our use case. I'm a little bit wondering about how we move forward from here, and I have to kind of tell management at my company, we're either working with the KubeVirt community to try to enhance KubeVirt so that it works in our use case, or do we try to move forward and work on this PR? I guess I'm a little confused about how to move forward from here.
I might be able to help.
May I just
go ahead.
So first, I think three remarks. One is, yeah, you need to be careful about disks, right? With all those workload controllers, but it sounded like you had an offline thread with David anyway. But attaching disks in that case of workload controllers, that is a specific topic, how that is dealt, how to deal with that. The other is actually wonder for this failover, if for you a setup wouldn't work, we just regularly bring up 2 VMs, right? 2 KubeVirt VMs, and you have a failing over service in front of them, right? I mean, services, if I'm not mistaken, they can also do failover. I mean, from a ready to a non-ready VM. I mean, they're
by label, yes.
traffic. Yeah, and so I wonder if that would also meet your use case, and I think it would at least be clearer from the higher level architecture, possibly, if it's meeting your use case, right? You put a service in front of 2 VMs, and if one is going down or there's an issue, then the traffic is pushed to the second VM. And the third one is, I forgot the third topic, and we can get back to how.
Well, the question that was raised right before this was basically, does it make sense to make this part of KubeVirt or to do something divergent? And I guess my insight on that is, this is something we've tried to do before, of course, but the reason that it keeps getting put on the back burner, I guess, is we never had a defined tangible use case that made sense to build around. So I think it's in everybody's best interest if it becomes part of the main KubeVirt code base. Just from a maintenance burden perspective, it's going to be easier on everybody if it's not something that's standalone or on the side. And yes, it's something we would definitely want to be involved in.
Okay, so maybe I can figure out a better place to I put more definition around our use case. I sent it in an email just to David, but maybe there's a place I can post that use case to be more clear for other people to comment on.
Yeah, the pull request or an email list thread, I think, would be appropriate.
Okay.
So there is an email thread that's started around this that's on our KubeVirt Devel mailing list that you could attach this to if you're interested. As far as moving forward for you all, the advice I would give is to research this proof of concept, see if it's something that that can be shaped roughly to meet your needs, and then tell us, and then we can work together on actually getting it supported. I would encourage you all to abandon it pretty quickly if it looks unwieldy and approach using your own custom resource layered on top of our API. If you see that the stateful set kind of meets your needs, but not quite, because that's going to be difficult for you all. If it's not a perfect fit, abandon it. That's essentially what I'm trying to get at.
Okay. Last thing is when you mentioned, Fabian, you mentioned failover service. Is that the same as what David's mentioning as the CR?
No, I think it's different. So with CRs, you could effectively write your own controller or operator, which is doing that steering, but I'm not sure I followed correctly. That in a Kubernetes service, right? And you effectively tie them to pods by using, one mechanism is using label selectors, and the service will be directing traffic to pods whenever they are ready, right? And if this service happens to be pointing to 2 pods, which happen to run KubeVirt VMs, and one of the pods is not ready anymore, then the traffic will naturally, right, just go to one of the VMs. So maybe that is also addressing your use case, right? At least you could play with it, because KubeVirt also has the ability to have liveness probes. And Roman, David, or whoever, please correct me if I'm wrong, right? But we have liveness probes, which can be used to check the health of the application within the VM. And they are directly used for the ready state of the VM.
Yeah, you're right. Just the terminology was mixed up. Liveness probe is for actually killing the VM or the thing, and readiness probe is just to indicate if it's ready to receive traffic or not.
Right, about the readiness probe. So that could be used to signal the readiness of the pod. So, and that is like, I would say that's a pretty common Kubernetes approach, right? Even if we just look at the servlet layer and the pod layer, that's pretty common, right?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you guys.
All right, next topic was also raised by you, and that is the Fedora requirement in Virt Launcher.
Okay, yes. So in a minute, I'll have Wendy comment on her work. So we have this HA system that we've containerized in Docker container, and we're trying to now make it a Virt launcher. So we have built KubeVirt, and we're trying to now go towards it being a Virt launcher. The problem that we face is that we have to use an old version of CentOS rather than Fedora, and an older version of QEMU to achieve what our code base is centered around, these older versions. And I'll let Wendy describe the cases where she had a failure and got it to work. Basically, using a version of Virt Launcher with Fedora, we can get it to work. We can build it our own version of Virt Launcher, and we can get it to work. But because we have this requirement on an older version, we wanted to understand what the dependency might be on Fedora in particular. Is that right, Wendy?
Right. So, as Daniel said, we have this pair of VMs. They're paired together, and from externally, they look like a single VM. And we accomplished that through a modified QEMU. And our last rebase of this was QEMU 262, and it's always been CentOS based. And so our requirement for this Virt launcher container would be QEMU 262. So I've been playing around with the process. I've been able to build my own libvirt container and put it in KubeVirt, build it with KubeVirt, edit my deployment so that Virt controller knows where to get this. And, it works with Fedora, but, clearly it's not working with an older CentOS, older QEMU. I wonder what your recommendations are for minimal QEMU. Are there some assumptions with KubeVirt as far as capabilities like, Q35 machine type or UFI or that sort of thing? Can you give me some guidelines?
This is tough to do right, I think. So you may be seen that we are doing a lot of testing upstream in KubeVirt. but we just test against the current QEMU unlimited version, which we just are using there. So we bring in a new QEMU unlimited version, we add new features based on it, remove workarounds if there were some problems with some QEMU bugs or so on. And what you're describing is then basically that you may run into the situation that you then run a QEMU version which we cannot use then because we don't know that it doesn't have some features or whatever. One example would, for instance, be that some QEMU versions had a bug that once you open a serial console connection once and you close it again, it just deleted the serial console socket by accident, so you couldn't connect with the serial anymore. So we had a workaround in place which made the file read-only, so that QEMU couldn't delete it anymore, right? We removed that. You're still on that version. The rest of KubeVirt is not, so suddenly you can't connect to any VM anymore. I think this is really tough to do right. Maybe David, Fabian, or someone else has some insights there too.
Yeah, I would say it's really tough. I mean, if you have enough lifetime, it's something to do. No, being more, I mean, technically, I mean, there's a few to extend to what Roman said, but yeah, we're looking to follow QEMU and to pick up the features. If you, for yourself, to really a heavy fork of KubeVirt, and you limit the API and extract all features which are depending on certain up-to-date delivered features, then you can at least ensure that it will that you don't use features that you don't use KubeVirt features which are not provided by delivered. But then you have the issues that it's not tested at all anymore, right? You effectively, I mean, what Roman alluded to is that you lose all the benefits we're doing all the testing upstream. However, the test suite is still provided. But you then need to thought through, identifying the test cases which still apply and run them. So it's a lot of work. What I wonder actually, maybe you're saying you use QEMU, right? So if I change the tone a little bit, I mean, what has come up also a couple of times, like 3 times in the past, is to have a different runtime for KubeVirt, right? To say, I know that others wanted to have a totally different runtime than QEMU or libvirt in the launcher. And so I wonder if we consider this very old QEMU to be just a different runtime, then to me that at least fits into this topic of having different runtimes for our KubeVirt API. However, this does not cover the area of having a different host OS, right? It would still be the same. So the idea would be with one Fedora base where the base OS is not so important, but we just aligned on Fedora, right? And then you have different runtimes, right? So there were requests about, I think it was like VirtualBox-like runtime and other runtimes, and QEMU could be one of those. To be honest, I think that's an area to investigate again, because there were so many to research it, and how I could imagine is that there is like a subset of the API fields we offer today is then supported by that new runtime. However, that would, and then then we gain the benefit that we could test the runtime in upstream. We could you can select which tests apply to this specific new runtime, but this would require that you can run on Fedora, and the second would be that you can upstream your heavily modified QEMU. And I'm not sure if any of these two requirements can be met by you. I mean, that's up to you, not to us.
There's something that is worth at least mentioning as part of this discussion, and that is we have an ongoing effort to limit the security surface of the Virt launcher container itself. And we're accomplishing that in large part due to moving responsibilities of Virt launcher to Virt handler. The difficulty here is that we're not necessarily publishing that because it's not in our minds until this point hasn't been something we've considered to be an API. And so we're definitely going to have to work with you to define what Virt launcher can and cannot do or should not be able to do just in terms of the interest of making KubeVirt secure overall, that defense in depth. Things we're looking at is like the sysadmin capability is currently needed by some networking components such as SRARV. We're looking at moving sysnice was that DHCP that needed that? Or no, that was that would needed netraw. And so there's just a few capabilities that we're moving functionality around. And in theory, that would be part of the Virt handler, Virt launcher code base, but some of it could play into the OS. For instance, if we're doing anything with IP tables or what have you. I don't think we are, but we'll just need to work through those details because this isn't something we had been thinking towards.
Have you ever considered having Virt launcher have like a more generic API that you control from Virt handler? What we really ideally need to do is we need to be able to create our own pod that has nothing to do with Virt launcher. It's just our pod, and it just has an API that matches what you expect to talk to, like a REST API, and have Virt handler talk to that API. And has that ever been a consideration in here?
I mean,
Well, that exists. We have a well-defined API between Virt handler and Virt launcher, and it is versioned and everything, but it is built around our VMI spec. So it still expects KubeVirt-like objects to be transferred back and forth.
Okay, David. Well, maybe we'll take it as an action then to understand more that API. It wasn't in my consciousness that there was an API like that to Virt launcher. So maybe that's the next step for us then on the Virt launcher path.
Possibly.
Wendy,
It's not a generic API, just to be clear. Like, it's definitely KubeVirt specific. If you all are doing enough customization work and everything, I mean, at some point, I question whether KubeVirt makes sense, or you just need to start a virtual machine in a pod, kind of using the techniques that we've kind of proven work for KubeVirt. That's another opportunity for you.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a valid point. All right. Thank you.
Something to read.
Sorry, one question. Can you shed a little bit of light on what the modifications are you doing to QEMU, just roughly? I mean, I'm not sure how much details you can share, but.
Well, it does get sensitive. It's best to just say that by modifying QEMU, we're able to do a very high level of HA. Okay, so we basically can lose no data if there's a catastrophic failure in the VM, in the node with the VM, the primary VM, the secondary one can pick up without any loss of data at all.
Okay.
By a very, very tight byte for byte sync.
Mm.
It's like a continuous live migration almost, it sounds like. Like you're continuously probably sharing pages and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
That, by the way, that topic actually came up in different forums here as well. I mean, I remember there was actually a patch very long ago on the Liver mailing list or QEMU mailing list about having this continuous live migration, right? Because the hot standby discussion, I mean, that was also a topic that was discussed here and there for KubeVirt in general, but it's nothing that we've pursued yet.
Just a question, because you said that by modifying QEMU, you are enabling a very high level of HA, but if you put both of your machines on the same pod, they will be on the same node, right? How it will help you?
Yeah, we never do that. Right, you're absolutely right. So we're always on a different set of hardware with the second VM.
Okay, so maybe I'm just suggesting here, yes, but maybe you could think of, instead of modifying Virt launcher, maybe you could somehow modify the migration process that we already have, and maybe it will might be a different approach to the same problem, and maybe it will be easier for you. I don't know.
Okay.
This would, of course, require tying back into Fabian's suggestion earlier that services could be the answer for network trafficking. And so if you've got a way to do live migration and networking, now you've completely embraced the native Kubernetes constructs, and you're not fighting any part of the infrastructure.
Yeah, that sacrifices what they're doing. So they're continually replicating the state in two places at one time, and that's how they're doing their failover. So it's not like it's the state that they're replicating, not necessarily. So in the service case, I'm speaking for these people, which is kind of funny. They're not trying to replicate necessarily the client connections. It sounds like there's actually like process state that's being replicated across two pods.
Yes, and we actually don't even need like an ingress controller to switch from one set of hardware traffic to the other. Like we don't actually use that because we're controlling the network traffic ourselves, and so we can switch between the nodes. Yeah.
So what this feature reminds me about is what VMware has, right? I think they have a similar feature where they have a concept of high available VM where they're permanently mirroring the whole state of the VM onto
Yes.
different nodes. Exactly. And I think there were a few attempts in QEMU to implement it too, right? You're probably aware of them. I just think none of them ever finished.
Right. And I think the closest thing has been the Linux live migration has been, something of interest. But yes, you're right.
I mean, in general, it's a very valuable feature for QEMU itself too. I just wonder how things are going there.
Well, eventually, I think it'll probably be, done at the, and it's a Linux project. We're not betting our future on that capability, but we're trying to grow into the Kubernetes infrastructure. So, okay, well, thank you, everybody. Very helpful.
Absolutely. And so I'll turn it over to Daniel Hiller to mention a new provider.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Okay, thanks. So yeah, we are a little bit behind in terms of KubeVirt providers regarding Kubernetes 1.18, which is already on revision version 3, I think. So yeah, we finally managed to create a provider on that, and the KubeVirt CI provider is already there, so it's merged to master. But the lane and the bumping of the KubeVirt itself is still pending. So yeah, but I think it should be in a couple of days. That's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Daniel. And I
Great to
think
hear.
just
Thanks.
go on.
Just said great to hear. Looking forward for 1.18.
Absolutely. So because we're short on time, I think I'll just move directly to the open floor without raising any new topics and turn it over to Daniel Belenki.
Yeah. So I don't know if you all are aware, but our project KubeVirt is participating in the CNCF summer internship program, and we have 2 interns which will join us for the internship period, and hopefully they will continue to contribute after. So I don't know if they're both are here. I see that Arthur is here. I don't know if Rifty is here, but maybe you want to introduce yourself to the KubeVirt community.
Okay. Hello, my name is Arthur. I'm from Brazil. I will be working with Daniel Belenki, Daniel Hiller, Fabian Deutsch. I don't know much what to say exactly. Just thank you for all the help.
Just
you
introduce
probably...
yourself.
That's it then.
Well, welcome. Glad to have you.
I guess that
Thank you.
Rifty is not here, but we have 2 interns, so Arthur and we have Rifty. So you might see them in Slack or in the mailing list. So
I'll
be
probably
nice and
ask a
helpful.
lot.
All right, and next topic, which we can obviously cover in exactly 5 minutes, David Vossel, talking about the release process revision.
Oh,
This might be a big topic. I don't know.
I wonder if you want
who
to...
snuck this in? Sure. Let me gather my thoughts for a second. All right, so I've been thinking about the release process for a bit, and my goal here, I'll turn my video and talk to y'all, is that I would like to automate everything and have it a process that is owned by the team collectively, and all the bits that are time-based just kind of happen on their own automatically. So what we have for our releases is we have a time-based releases where they occur monthly, ideally like at the beginning of the month. And it's well understood like when they're going to occur, and they're not content-based, meaning that we don't have a specific set of content that needs to make it in before we're going to cut release. We can theoretically cut a release any point we want directly out of master. So in the future, in order to automate all of this, we occasionally have times where we need to perhaps hold up a release because we've detected some instability or something like that. So we need an automated way of signaling that the release needs something to be resolved or at least looked at before it's going to be automatically cut. So I'm working on that part. And kind of the follow-up and the eventual end result of all this is I would like for the actual release branch to be cut automatically by a cron job, and for the release to be triggered automatically, maybe with a manual, like just glance and a push of a button saying that, this CI has passed and all that. And the point of all this is that it gets everyone out of being a single, like there's no single owner necessarily of releases. It's a collective team effort where everyone can signal information that they need about what's potentially a stability problem or something like that, and impact this automated process of kind of pushing out releases. So I kind of stumbled through all of that. It's something I'm investigating right now. I don't have a lot to show anyone. And it's something that you'll probably hear more about, and I'll be asking a lot more feedback on in the future. And of course, I'm interested in anyone's immediate thoughts on that as well, if there are any. I'm done with my rambling.
I have a question. Sorry
Sure.
for jumping in. So at least as I see it, usually releases are triggered by tags, right? So you said that you want to trigger the release with a cron job. So how do you see it? You see that the cron job runs the test, and if it decides that it's time to release, it pushes a tag and does a release, or the other way around?
I think we're conflating the term of GitHub release with the concept of a stable branch, which is what we sort of think of as a release.
So the branch is going to be automatically cut at the first of the month, I would imagine. Whether the actual stable release is tagged and pushed out to GitHub, that's dependent on CI passing and ensuring that any potential blocker issues we have are resolved and potentially backported to this release branch. And there's a whole discussion about what constitutes a blocker. We have very, very strict criteria that we would have about the ability to block a release. It would have to be something that like maybe just the approvers would have access to, or things like that. But the cron would kick off the creation of the branch, and ideally kick off the tag and release process as well. But that process would be gated by mechanisms that basically have distributed ownership across the whole team. So the ability to block that tag from occurring until we feel confident that everything's stable, which should be most of the time. But we have the kind of escape hatch there. Does that help? I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe I need to to read the documents that you sent and the proposals, because at least now it sounds to me like a release can happen without a tag, right?
A release branch can be cut. A release will happen, but it will be tagged just like it is today. It's just that a human won't be involved.
Okay.
Right.
So we currently have the concept of release candidates that we're pushing or tagging on the repo before we actually cut the branch. Is that going to tie into this at all?
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. We could have the policy of automating the release branch on the first of the month, creating immediately a release candidate, and then saying if nobody raises any concerns, this is automatically going to turn and be promoted as the official stable release 7 days later or something like that. Like these are all things that we kind of find like we need to sort through, but it's that kind of automation that I would like to just have the process just working for us. And it makes it predictable for the upstream community as well of when releases would happen, and they have visibility into exactly why they didn't occur. So if a release didn't get cut, there's going to be an easy way of sorting why it didn't occur, because you'd be able to see, well, these labels are associated with these issues, and those have to be closed before the automated process is going to promote a release candidate.
Okay, well,
We'll see if it works. I concede that there's definitely topics here that need to be sorted out still.
Absolutely. Are there any final thoughts on this before we close? All right, we'll follow up on the mailing list or solicit feedback in the future. And with that, thanks everybody. It's been a full meeting. Have a great week.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye.